It seems curiously prophetic that Beethoven's First Symphony should be premiered in the year 1800. As the esteemed British musicologist Sir Donald Francis Tovey remarks, this symphony is a fitting farewell to the 18th century. Beethoven had been making sketches for the first movement of a symphony in C major since 1795. Interestingly, these sketches were found among the counterpoint exercises that Beethoven wrote under the instruction of Albrechtsberger. So you can just imagine that the aspiring young composer was not content with simply working on exercises and was eager to take on more ambitious creative projects. These initial ideas for a symphonic first movement eventually found their way into the finale of the First Symphony, and Beethoven then composed the other three movements from scratch. Beethoven had arrived in Vienna in 1792, aiming to launch his career as pianist and composer in the musical capital of Europe. As a pianist, Beethoven quickly established his reputation as one of the finest performers of his day. And by the late 1790s, he was ready to tackle the prestigious genres of the string quartet and the symphony in order to establish his name as a composer. The premiere of the First Symphony took place on April 2, 1800 at the Burgtheater, the theater of the Imperial Palace, where other celebrated works like Mozart's Marriage of Figaro and Haydn's Creation had also been premiered. So you can easily imagine that this must have been a momentous occasion for Beethoven. Moreover, this was the first concert in Vienna that Beethoven mounted for his own benefit, and the concert program was well calculated in that it presents Beethoven's works alongside those of Mozart and Haydn, thus asserting Beethoven's claim as the musical heir to these acknowledged masters. As mentioned in the previous video, writing a symphony was a risky venture, and as it was also a new task for Beethoven, we should not be surprised to see that he relied heavily on tradition, on the inheritance of Haydn and Mozart, in his First Symphony. Compared to his early piano sonatas and chamber works, this symphony appears quite conservative. It reveals Beethoven's superb competence within the classical tradition, but avoids radically subverting that tradition. Even though Beethoven had never written a symphony before, he was well prepared for the endeavor. First of all, he was not a complete beginner when it comes to writing orchestral music. Furthermore, while he was still living in Bonn, Beethoven not only studied piano and composition, but he also gained valuable experience playing the viola in the highly skilled court orchestra of the Elector Max Franz, who was a keen music lover. The distinctive sound of the First Symphony has much to do with the prominence of ascending scales. Here are three notable instances. In the first movement's recapitulation, we get this transitional passage. Similarly, the third movement begins with an inexorably rising line. And an ascending scale is incorporated into the catchy main theme of the finale. Now that we are aware of this feature, let's put these passages into their context as we discuss each movement in turn. The first movement begins with a short, slow introduction. Though only 12 measures long, this introduction offers some surprising twists. The opening gesture is a case in point. It is surprising in both syntax and harmony. Curiously, the pair of chords that initiates the movement seems like a cadence. You could end a piece of music with this gesture, perhaps like this. Moreover, the key is wrong. we appear to be in F major, not C major. When the pair of chords is transposed down a fourth in the next measure, the music could conceivably correct its course to C major. But instead, Beethoven gives us another twist with a deceptive motion. Then, with growing emphasis, the gesture of two chords is amplified and lands on a G major harmony. What are we to make of all this? Harmonically, the pairs of chords are seemingly unrelated, encapsulated in their own little worlds. The overall effect is disorienting and tonally ambiguous. Yet melodically, we can make out a pattern of chromatic ascent if we think of the middle pair of chords as a kind of parenthetical statement or an aside. There's a good reason for doing this. When we compare this introduction with the overture to the ballet The Creatures of Prometheus, which Beethoven wrote in 1801, we can see some striking similarities. The off-tonic start implying F major and the stronger progression towards G major are features that we already observed in the symphony's introduction. But in the overture, the chromatic ascent in the top line is very clear. I think that this is the underlying melodic idea in the symphony's introduction as well. In fact, these opening measures, despite appearing somewhat whimsical and unexpected, contain the germinal ideas for the entire movement. These ideas are the rising second and the chromatic ascent, which is formed by extending that rising second. We can see that both ideas inform the construction of the main theme. First of all, as we make the transition from the slow introduction into the allegro proper, the sustained B in the treble resolves to C, creating the rising second. This B to C motion is immediately repeated in a lower register as part of a figure in dotted rhythm. Let's call this figure X. Interestingly, this figure may be derived from Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. And we can even trace the lineage of this little figure onwards to Schubert's Second Symphony as well. Now getting back to the B to C motion as we transition into the allegro, if we were to extend this rising second into a chromatic ascent, then we would need to add C sharp and D, and this is exactly what Beethoven does in measures 18 and 19. So now the parallels between the main theme and the slow introduction are clear. I think that becoming aware of details such as this helps us to better appreciate Beethoven's compositional craftsmanship. Looking at the orchestral score, we can see that the main theme is made up of interlocking materials. A 5-measure phrase in the strings overlaps with a 3-measure phrase in the winds. The overall effect is a seamless flow of ideas, not a series of clear-cut granitic statements. In general, we can observe that Beethoven's orchestration treats the winds and strings as equal partners, which was considered unusual at the time. As one contemporary reviewer complains, the wind instruments were used too much, so that it was more wind band music than full orchestral music. The transition begins energetically with a 4-measure phrase that is immediately elaborated, becoming more rhythmically active. Figure X returns in measure 41. It is treated sequentially and then compressed into ascending fourths, building up energy to the medial caesura, the moment of punctuation before the arrival of the subordinate theme. The subordinate theme also features interlocking, this time between wind instruments, accompanied by staccato arpeggios in the strings. Interestingly, the head motive of this theme may be derived from the low-register downward flourish in the main theme. The closing material brings back figure X in an emphatic gesture. And at the end of the exposition, the rising second that is part of this figure now truly serves a cadential function. Part of the development section seems to be structurally modeled on the development section from the first movement of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. In particular, the emphasis on E as the dominance of A minor, which is eventually resolved upwards to F, is something that Beethoven may have observed in Mozart's symphony. If he took this idea from Mozart, however, he made it his own in a startlingly effective way. In Beethoven's symphony, the emphasis on the dominance of A minor comes near the end of the development section, which makes the expected return to C major appear perplexingly remote. But in one ingenious stroke, a unison E rises to F, and this F is interpreted as the seventh of a G7 chord, and before we know it, we suddenly find ourselves drawn back to the tonic and the return of the main theme. This gesture may seem abrupt, but it is actually well prepared. After all, the start of the movement features the very same E to F motion. In the recapitulation, the chromatic ascent first hinted at in the introduction becomes greatly extended, as if the energy latent in that opening gesture can finally be given full expression. The second movement captures the elegance of the early classical style. Cast in sonata form, Beethoven displays his contrapuntal craftsmanship in the main theme, which becomes embellished in the recapitulation. By the way, you may notice that this opening seems to bear some kinship to the slow movement from Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor. The key is F major, the subdominant, which is a conventional key choice for the slow movement. In comparison, Beethoven had used the more adventurous key of E major for the slow movement of his piano sonata in C major, Opus 2 No. 3. In the closing theme, there is a noteworthy passage in which the timpani is treated as a distinctive contributor to the musical texture in its own right, rather than serving its usual role as reinforcement. The flute's ascending scale in measures 188 to 190 is a subtle hint of the lively ascending scale that will initiate the third movement. Most commentators agree that the third movement is by far the most innovative movement in this symphony. Though labeled minuet, it is really a scherzo in all but name. Note that the tempo marking is allegro molto e vivace. The movement is characterized by the kind of relentless rhythmic drive that will become the hallmark of Beethoven's symphonic scherzo style. In terms of its proportions, the minuet appears quite lopsided. The first section is only 8 measures long, while the second section is 71 measures long. The first section begins with an energetic rising scale, exploring chromatic inflections along the way. F sharp, G sharp, and C sharp. These chromatic tones can be enharmonically interpreted as scale degrees 4, 5, and 1 in D flat major. And indeed, the second section realizes this possibility and boldly modulates to D flat major. Then, Beethoven manages to make his way back to C major through surreptitious slides in measures 33 to 44. The clash between D-flat and D-natural near the end of the minuet is a striking instance of the kind of brusque humor that Beethoven greatly enjoyed. The trio is not as rhythmically driven as the minuet. It features a contrast between pulsing motion in the winds and swirling motion in the strings. The finale is most notable for its comical introduction. Whereas the introduction to the first movement was harmonically teasing, this introduction is melodically teasing. The initial 2T unison G, marked fortissimo, seems to portend something serious. But what follows is anything but serious. A rising scale is tentatively taking shape, one step at a time. It is as if Beethoven were playing peekaboo with his audience. Cast in sonata form, this Haydnesque finale maintains its bright, playful spirit throughout. In fact, the simple folk-like main theme is reminiscent of the main theme from the finale of Haydn's Symphony No. 88 in G major. Overall then, Beethoven's First Symphony is a conventional work in the tradition of Haydn and Mozart. But as we'll see in the next video, Beethoven would quickly find his voice as a symphonic composer in his Second Symphony. Thanks for watching.